I'm Mark Roberts from IBM. If you have any questions, please enter them in the questions feature and we'll answer them at the end. For now, I'll pass you over to Mark.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mark Roberts from IBM, and I'm an UrbanCode technical consultant. I've been working with the UrbanCode products since the acquisition by IBM about 2 years ago, and we're very busy. There's a huge amount of interest in these products for what they can do for deployment automation. Now, I always like to describe UrbanCode Deploy that we're going to focus on today with regards to where it fits into the software development lifecycle. So I think it's quite important to position all of these different software components that make up your software development lifecycle. And I always see UrbanCode Deploy really fitting in, picking up after a build has been completed. So we complete a build of some software unit of some kind, generate some deployable unit, and it's a case of what do we next do with that. And it's at that point really that a lot of continuous integration processes tend to fall down, because we've got great processes involved in development whereby developers check in code, builds get kicked off automatically, maybe some unit testing is done. But that tends to be the point where a lot of development processes stop. And actually deploying the code into some sort of indicative runtime system tends to be the part that gets a little bit more problematic, a little bit slower, involves a bit of wading through treacle, often because environments are not available, or environments are not configured properly, or environments have become, out of date, or aren't really representative anymore of a production system. So what we're trying to do here is improve that process and turn continuous integration into more of a continuous delivery process, whereby we're bolting on to the end of the continuous integration process the ability to deploy code into some sort of runtime. So we get interested really where you've already built some sort of deployable unit, maybe an EAR file or a WAR file, some kind or something, maybe a broker file that needs to be deployed into some sort of runtime, and we then want to pick that up and we want to manage that for you and push that through into a deployable environment. And that environment could be 1 or 2 machines for a development environment perhaps, or it might be 200 or 300 machines for a production environment. I'm going to explain today how we really don't care how big the estate is that you're deploying into. It's not particularly relevant to the processes that we develop and the techniques that we use. And we maintain consistency across that life cycle, across that route to live. So we're not going to ask you to change your processes just because we're hitting development or we're hitting pre-production, and because pre-production has an F5 load balancer, which has some sort of load balancing function built into it, and maybe production has a load balancer as well. Well, guess what? Development doesn't have that, so it starts to look like it's different environments and we need to deploy things in a different manner. But that's really not the case. And some of that will become clearer as we go through today. So I want to start off really just with a diagram. You may have been expected to be confronted by hours and hours of PowerPoint slides this afternoon. I'm not going to force that on you. I'm just going to start off with a picture. And I want you to start to think really about the application that you need to deploy today. And the application for us here is represented by this top left corner. And here's our application. So this is something that delivers some unit of function for your organization. It might be, I don't know, an internet bank. It might be a lottery sales system. I don't think we've got anyone from those types of organizations on today, but you know what I mean. It's something that you log into. It could be a travel site. And we all know that those systems are made up of various different components. So here we've just got component 1 and component 2. But in the real world, let's just think, for example, about a travel site. That's going to be the web interface. There's going to be some rich content on there of photographs and video. There's going to be a database that holds reviews. There's going to be a pricing information. And there's going to be integrations into various different back-end systems to work out pricing, to hook up with flight systems to make sure that there are flights available and hotel rooms. And it's a large system made up of many, many components that interact with various different things, but ultimately all these different components of web, of database, of content, they all start to come together to form our application. So when you decide that you wanted to redeploy a new version of your application, it's all these different components that you need to touch. And that's kind of where we start, because in the top left corner here we have application process. And there, what we're trying to show is really the orchestration and the ordering of the manner in which we're going to plow through these various different components, getting them deployed as fast as possible. And in the ideal world, we want to do everything at the same time. Why wait? You know, we're talking to various different computer systems to provide this web system that we need to deploy to. So let's do things in parallel as much as possible. But you will probably be aware of things within your systems that do need to be done one after another in a more sequential manner. That's the sort of thing that we will manage within the application process here. When we look at the process within the component, it gets a little bit more detailed. And this is where we are dealing with the specific technologies of that particular component. So if we're interacting with a database, that's likely to be the execution of some sort of SQL script. If we're dealing with a WebSphere system, that might be some specific commands that will stop a WebSphere application server from running, that will unload an application, that will load a new application. And specifically the thing that I'm going to show you today, it could be some Tomcat interaction. It could be stopping an application, unloading it, loading a new one, reloading, or whatever. And there are various different technologies that we touch on in that way. But we need to remember that this component process here is where we write the detailed steps of the things that we need to do to that specific component. And that could be things such as copying files, deleting old content, unzipping files, doing name-value pair replacements, and so on. And the place we get a lot of those name-value pairs from comes from the properties. And we store an awful lot of properties within the UrbanCode product. The bigger conversation that we have with customers when we are investigating this product in detail is what are the properties and the parameters that we need to store? What do they relate to? Do they relate to that individual component? And do they not change across your route to live? Or are they those components things that do relate to that component, but actually they're different in every single environment that we have? Classic example of that is a database URL. The connection string that we have within our application to connect to a database is kind of hope different between development, QA, pre-production, and production. We don't want to be mixing those up. So we need to be environmentally specific about certain properties and parameters within our applications that we deploy. I kind of think properties and parameters probably means the same thing actually, so I should probably stick to just one word, I suppose. Now, another thing that we need to manage is the versions of this content. You will have developers working on the construction of your code. You will have content authors putting together new various amounts of content. You'll have database administrators and DBAs writing database scripts, SQL scripts for you. Those are probably all managed in some sort of source code management system. So they might be held in products like Rational Team Concert, Rational ClearCase, Git, Subversion, various different technologies like that. And there are times when we need to interact with those and pull in new versions of content into the component. And we manage multiple versions of these components within the UrbanCode Deploy product. And there's great reasons to do that. One reason is that we then have control over the content, and we can present to you the choices about what versions of content should be deployed into each of our environments that we're going to come on to in a second. But there are certain types of content, such as our binaries that we're going to produce, an EAR file or a WAR file, that don't really come from the source code management system. There are very, very few organizations that will extract a load of Java code, compile it into an EAR file, and then put the EAR file back into source code management for UrbanCode to pick up from there. That just doesn't happen. So realistically, what's likely to happen then is we will interact with things like the Rational Team Concert build, with Jenkins, with Cruise Control, with various other different build systems, such that that build system pushes this newly generated binary object into UrbanCode and generates a new version of that particular component as we are going through the build process. Now, let's have a look at the environments. And I mentioned the environments could be very different. If we look here, the 4 environments that we've got listed are a development environment, a single server, and some environment properties. Then we go to system integration test. We split off the application server and the web server components into different machines, and we also have a database server. Got various different properties around that as well. And then when we get to pre-production, we have 2 application servers and a load balancer, and pre-production and production are the same. Now, it doesn't matter what that environment looks like. The processes that we define here for the component really describe the operations to perform on a specific machine, and really describe the where to put the content on a specific machine. So if it happens that when we're running development, it's this single server here, or if it happens when we're running in production that we've mapped component 1 to this particular application server, that process will run against that machine. So all we need to do is create a mapping between the components that we have and the resources within our environment that we actually want to talk to. So hopefully by that quick introduction, in about 12 minutes, we've covered really what UrbanCode is, where it fits into the software development lifecycle. We've looked at the notion of the application that you want to deploy and the process orchestration. We've looked at the components and some of the details around that, and had a quick look at the environments. So now it's time to go and have a look at UrbanCode and start to show you some of this stuff actually running, and show you this relevant Tomcat and the sorts of things that we can do with Tomcat. So I'm going to pause there and just ask Tajinder if we have any questions in the Q&A box at the moment while we switch over to the virtual machine to show you the product running.
We haven't had any questions as of yet.
Okay, good. So which machine do I want? I want this one. So hopefully now you can see a screen that looks a little bit more like Linux and a little bit less like Windows. And you should be able to see a Firefox web browser running on this machine in here. So this is a good point to mention that the main user interface for working with UrbanCode Deploy as a person is a web browser. So there's nothing to install on your local machine. There is a thin client that you can use if you wish. It's just a command line client that's available to you, and you can download that from the tools menu up here. Which is very simple. To once you're connected to the website, you can go and download the UrbanCode Deploy client from there if you wish. You would tend to use that for some automated operations and for plugging into things like Jenkins and the Rational Team Console build system, so that we can automate some operations. There's a paper coming out that I've written for Developer Works. It should be coming out in the next few weeks on connecting UrbanCode Deploy with Rational Team Concept's build system. If anybody wants a copy of that ahead of time, then I can send you the version that has the nice pictures in before they get redrawn from the web, and has some decent diagrams in. So I can send you that in just a PDF format if anybody wants it. But if you do, then just contact us via Tajinder at Ranger 4, and we can get that sent to you. So as you see across the top menu here, we've got components, we've got applications, and the two things that we were spending our time looking at earlier on that picture. And if we go into applications, we get a list presented here of all of the applications that we have. I'm going to make this a little bit larger just because I'm not sure how it's coming through on the that's better. So zoom in a little bit because it might not be coming through that clearly on the Citrix system that you're using to watch it. So we've got a number of applications that we can deploy here, and we'll touch on a few of these a little bit later on. But the one we're interested in really here is called Tomcat deployment. Pretty obvious from the name what this one is doing, but this is really just an application deployment. And as soon as you go into the application, we start to see the route to live. We start to see the environments that exist for this particular application. And I've got development, QA, and production. Development and QA. I probably should have a production environment as well. So I'm going to go and create a production environment, and I'll pick a color for that one. Let's have Firebrick, dark red for that one. Save that. I've just created a new environment. What I need to do now to put that environment actually into use is I need to map some of my resources that are out there running the UrbanCode Deploy agent to that production environment, and then I could start running deployments to that straight away. Now we can see for the development environment here, the compliancy of it tells me we've got 3 out of 3. That means that I've attempted to deploy 3 things to it, and I've successfully deployed 3 things to it. So if we had any issues with our deployment, if we're still developing our processes and things have not been working properly, we start to see a little bit of red creeping in and there from the right-hand side instead of all those nice green lines, and we start to get an indication of the sort of success that we've had with that deployment. If we want to look at the list of components that we have within a particular application, we can go to the Components tab. And we see 3 here that we're talking about today, which is the Tomcat server itself that we're going to deploy, the JPEG Store application, and a database to go with it. So we have our Tomcat server, which is a component. We're going to actually deploy the Tomcat server. So on the system we're deploying to, there is nothing installed there at the moment. There is no Tomcat binaries present. There's no Tomcat configuration. It's obviously not started because it's not physically there. But we're going to push the Tomcat application down to the server. We're going to start it, and then immediately we're going to deploy our application to it. Now, logic dictates that from there, really, I should go and run some tests. And we can do that from within UrbanCode. We can execute automated tests from directly within the product. So you can execute things like Selenium tests, you can execute Rational Quality Manager, and a few other technologies as well. So if you have suites of tests that you've created in Rational Quality Manager, then you can pick the one that you want to run against this system that you've just deployed and see what the results come back with. If I go back to my environments and I decide to open up one of the environments, I start to see what has been deployed into that environment, and I start to see the version that's been deployed. So as I said earlier on, we store multiple versions of these assets within UrbanCode Deploy, so it works well to have displayed within the inventory for an environment the versions of the content that have actually been deployed into that area. So we can see the Tomcat server version 8.03 was deployed. Our JPEG Store application was at 1.1, and our database was at 1.0. I don't think anything has been deployed into QA, but if we had, we could start to see that environment as well and see what was in there. And if you're thinking that in your environment, you actually probably would have more than 3 components, you might have 33 or 303, doing it by eye would get a little bit difficult. So there's a compare function here where we can compare any environment with any other. And if I compare my development environment with my production environment, then not surprisingly, it just lists the versions that have been deployed into development. But if any different versions have been deployed into production, they would appear as additional lines on that table, and it would show the version and show the tick to see what's in production. So it gives you the opportunity to see what's lagging behind and which components need to be brought up to date in a particular environment. Now, I want to show you the process here, and I'm going to kind of walk through some of the things that we showed in that diagram. But I want to show you the deploy JPEG Store application to Tomcat. And this process here is the application process, so we're still in our Tomcat deployment application. So I'm looking at the process for orchestrating the deployment. And here, quite simply, all we see is that it's going to install Tomcat server. That's going to call a further process, a specific process within the Tomcat server component. It's going to install Tomcat. It's then going to install the JPEG Store application into Tomcat. Now, the database component of my application is completely separate to the Tomcat server or the application itself. So in reality, I can fire that off at the same time. That can take as long as it likes, and ultimately they're going to come together at this join, and when they have both completed, we'll satisfy the entry conditions for this join switch statement here, and then we'll go through to finish. So here, really, we're just looking at the orchestration, the ordering of the things that we want to run. Now, if I go back to my components and have a look now at the Tomcat server itself, we'll start to show you some details about any component within UrbanCode. And I'm going to use the Tomcat server instance here as our example and talk you through this and then show you the processes that we use. Now, immediately we jump to a component. We don't see the environments, but what we see is the inventory for the component and where specifically it has been deployed. So if we've got multiple versions of this particular component deployed to different virtual machines within our test environments, then we would see multiple lists down here. We only have one in this instance, so it tells me that I've deployed this to this VM93 server 03, and that's just the identifier for another virtual machine that's running over here that we'll have a look at in a second, and it tells me that version 803 was deployed on this particular date, so just a little bit earlier on today. If we'd had multiple versions of this component, or even the same version deployed to different physical machines or different virtual machines, you would see that there. So if you're, say, spinning up machines on, an IBM software cloud instance, and you've got some registered machines on there, you're going to want to keep a good tidy view of the inventory on them to make sure you're getting your money's worth from these machines running in someone else's data center, and you'll be able to see that list in there against what's deployed to each resource. You also see the component request history, and we see the different operations that have been performed, and typically these are removal and creation operations of the Tomcat server, identifies the resource and the version that's been used. So you can see that multiple versions have been used over the last few days. If we have a look at the configuration for this, it tells us which file system source configuration type and the version control system that this particular component is connected to. And it's worth showing you the list of what's available in this particular area. It doesn't look like it's going to allow me to show you that without clearing the list. So I'll show you that later on from a different perspective. But this one is connecting to the file system, and it's using what we call a versioned file system. Now, just the ordinary file system that we have at this location here is not particularly versioned, but any directory that we have underneath that Tomcat directory will appear as the version identifier, and the content of that directory will then become the versioned content that is pulled into UrbanCode. And where does that go? Well, if we go and look at our versions tab in here, these are all the versions of Tomcat that are available for us to use, and you can see here that they have a status applied to them called ready for development. Now 801 wasn't configured correctly, so it's not available for use in development. So we've got a bit of a quality assessment here that we can load new content into UrbanCode. We might try and deploy it, and we might find actually that one doesn't work properly. So we can either choose to delete it, or we can leave it in there, and we can then just say that we will mark it so that it's not going to be used in development. It's not going to be used in any other environment either. If we have a look at one of these specifically, go into one of these versions, you see the status that's been allocated to it, which is kind of like a quality indicator for that particular version. And then if you scroll down to the artifacts area, we can see you've got 10 megabytes of data held within the UrbanCode Deploy file storage area. It consists of 492 files, and you can see what they all are. So you won't be surprised if you're Tomcat users to find what we're seeing in here in these various different directories. This is all the content that's going to be downloaded when we kick off a deployment in a second. But before we do that, let's go and have a look at the processes that we've created for this. And the main one we're interested in really is creating a Tomcat server. Now, there's a fair amount of UrbanCode Deploy syntax in here, but the way it's presented is really easy to read. If I just was to shut up for a minute and let you read down the screen here what we've got in these boxes, it would become very obvious what's going on. If I showed you a Unix shell script to perform the same operation, it would probably take a little bit longer to figure out exactly what's going on, and it would be a little bit more cryptic in terms of what it's doing. The first step that we have down here is called the download artifacts. So that is the step that is going to take all of those files that we just looked at, those 492 files, and it's going to copy them to the target machine to which we are running this deployment. So we've got a target machine out there on our infrastructure somewhere or in a cloud somewhere, and that target machine is running the UrbanCode Deploy agent, and that allows us to communicate with it and send it the content that we want to deploy. And it will download that content into either a default location or into a specific location that we name. If we click on the pencil, we can have a look at some of the detail, and it shows the working directory of where this is going to download to. Now, this is the syntax that we use for variables within UrbanCode Deploy. We have $curly bracket p colon, then the scope for the variable, and then the actual name of the variable, and then a close curly bracket. So this one is identified as an environment-specific property, and it's called Tomcat _ Catalina home. So you're probably familiar with the Catalina directory for Tomcat. It just specifies the home location. So I've used the syntax here of using Tomcat _ to help me to group together the various different properties that we need to set for Tomcat. And I'll show you those in a second. But it's specified to be an environment-specific property, which means that I could actually put this in different locations depending on whether I'm in my dev environment or whether I'm in my pre-production or my production environment. So I could specify it that way. And you can see the other properties that need to be filled out. Whenever you float the mouse over one of these, you get a little pop-up help panel that explains what each particular step is for and what it's doing. Now, if you want to create new steps across here, it's really easy to do. If you just use this palette here on the left-hand side to make this a little bit bigger, use this palette here on the left-hand side, and that shows you all of the different plugins that you have chosen to download into your particular UrbanCode Deploy instance. So if we have a look at application servers, Java application servers, we've got 4 listed here. So we've got an example here of JBoss, various different operations that we can perform to JBoss. And we've got an example here for WebSphere and for WebSphere Liberty for things that we can do to that. And specific to today, we've got Tomcat. And we've got a list of things that we can do with that. So this process here is about installing Tomcat. But if we have a look at one of these, drag on start application, drop it down somewhere on the drawing surface, and then it pops up and asks us to fill in things like the manager URL, the manager username and password and context in. You can probably guess that the ones with the red asterisk against them are mandatory parameters that we have to fill out. Other things are optional. Now, one thing that we have there is post-processing scripts. One real bugbear for a lot of people with regard to deployment is that after something has been done to a server, some process has been run, say, by a Unix shell script that you might have, you then have to log onto the box and go and have a look at a log file and make sure that something has been done properly. We need to go and look and get a value out of something or look for the word success. Well, UrbanCode Deploy pulls back any log file information that you will need. So if you're executing a command such as a copy command, for an example, simple example, the stuff that would echo to the screen normally gets brought back with the UrbanCode Deploy command anyway. But if there are additional log files that you're interested in, that's really simple. If you just cap them to the screen or type them to the screen, depending on which operating system you're on, they will also be captured by the UrbanCode Deploy process and be brought back to the server. So from this central web-based console, when you're executing processes, you get to see the results of executing those processes, and you get to, it becomes very easy for you to see the results. Now, when you get all those results back, some commands that you will be using and some things you'll be familiar with, I just kill off a call on my mobile. Some of the commands that you'll be familiar with will scroll up a fair bit of text on the screen, and you have to look at that and identify whether or not that's acceptable, whether it's been successful. You can introduce additional post-processing scripts if you want to perform additional validation operations. So I've got here validate WebSphere version, is WebSphere ND profile installed, get Tomcat major version. These are all individual little post-processing scripts that I've written to do some validation or to extract some information from a particular command. Now I'm just going to put any values in here. I'm not going to save this one. I just want to show you how we can join these things together. So you literally then put the mouse in the center of one of the previous steps, draw it across, and draw it across there. And I've now just created an alternative route through now where we zigzag across to the start application. Doesn't particularly make a great deal of logical sense, but you can see how things can flow. Now, one of the things that you need to do to configure a Tomcat environment is to modify the server XML file. And the way that we've done that in this instance is to replace some tokens in the server XML file. And what we're looking for is we're going to look for a file called server.xml. We have a start and end token delimiters, which are the @sign. And we are going to replace that with all environmental properties. So I need a couple of more screens up here to show you how we're going to do this. So I need to show you the file first. So let's go to our Tomcat server, go into one of our versions, and let's go and find our server.xml file. And I'm going to download that file. And where did it put it? There it is. And I'll open that with my editor. Now, many of you will be familiar with the content of this file, but the thing that we're really looking for here is where we put variables into the file. So here we've got the connector section, which you're probably familiar with modifying to satisfy different ports and different connection timeout and things like that on your system. So, but here we replace the value with @tomcat_connector port @. And what we are looking for is we're going to look for that particular string, and if we find it, we'll replace it with a value that's specified in our UrbanCode Deploy environment. If we go back to our browser for a second, and if we just go and open up another window, go into our Tomcat deployment, we now go into our development environment and look at the properties defined within here. And within here, we've got, I've forgotten the name of it already, Tomcat connector port. And here we've got Tomcat connector port. So it specifies the value of 8180. So when we run that replacement step, it's going to go and look in our environment. It's going to say, have we got a variable with this particular name where I found the start and end delimiters? And if we have, I'm going to replace that value into this particular file. So the server XML file starts off in this tokenized format. The thing that gets downloaded is exactly this file with these various different tokenized things in. And it's not going to run like that at all. But before it runs, we have the process here that will replace those with actual values specified from within our environment. And once we've done that, we've got our server XML file ready to go. So instead of holding multiple versions of server XML and thinking, have I copied the right one from the right place to support that particular environment and that particular port, or by the way, I need to run 20 copies of Tomcat on a single server, well, you just create those as different environments on UrbanCode Deploy. They could all even target the same machine, because if we go back to our environment here and go into our environment, we see the machine that it's targeting for that particular environment. Well, we could have 5 environments called Development 1, Development 2, Development 3, and so on. They could all even be targeting this same machine. But by using these environment-specific variables within UrbanCode, we can specify that when you download the components for this one, you use an environment-specific variable to tell UrbanCode where to put the files. And that goes into Development 1's directory. And then for Development 1 environment, we're going to use this particular port and this particular port for the other various different things we need to do Tomcat. So it's really easy to manage that and see it and visualize it and compare environments and start to understand, have we got clashes, are we putting things in the right place or not, and really control the environment and help you to get the job done. Now, the next things we do are quite straightforward. We've got some add execute permissions to the shell script so we can execute them. We make a modification to the Tomcat users XML file, very similar to what we saw earlier on. This is just using the sed command to pipe in some information into the Tomcat users file. We create the logs directory, and then we start the Tomcat server running, just using the typical startup shell command. So we now have a little floppy disk window here. It's very high tech, isn't it, a floppy disk? That indicates that I should press that button to save this and create a new version of this process, but I'm not going to because I don't want to save that change I made. If you have a look at the remove's dead simple. It just shuts Tomcat down and then removes the Tomcat instance and tidies up the directory and gets rid of it. Let's go and have a look at another process though now, because that installs Tomcat onto that particular server. But then we want to deploy an application onto Tomcat. So let's have a look at our JPEG store application. Now the inventory shows a lot more where it's being loaded onto various different machines in various different guises. If we go and have a look at the processes, we've got deployment for this one to go to WebSphere Application Server, WebSphere Liberty, WebSphere ND, in various different formats. But we'll have a look at the deploy app to Tomcat process for this one. And you'll see similar things going on, but in this one, we do another type of update operation, because within the content of the jar file that I'm trying to deploy, we have a property file. And that property file contains a database URL. And what I want to do is I want to update that on a per environment basis. So I download my artifacts, I expand the WAR file out, and we've got an unzip command built into UrbanCode Deploy that's going to do the extraction. So it's going to extract the content into this particular directory. We then update a property file. So I'm going to update my database.properties file, which is to be found in this location. And I'm going to update the URL equals to get a variable from environment/db URL. So again, this is the classic example of a database connection string being different between development, QA, pre-production, and production. And once I've done that update and got my new version of database.properties, I update the WAR file. Then we had a little bit of jiggery-pokery to do, because those of you that are really familiar with Tomcat may be aware that actually the manager URL for Tomcat is different between versions 6, 7, and 8. I think it's the same between 6 and 7, but it's certainly different between, I think it's 7 and 8. So what I then had to do was get hold of the latest version of Tomcat, and then I had to construct the manager URL based on what the Tomcat major version number was. So I get the latest Tomcat version number, and all that command does is get a property from UrbanCode, which is the latest version of a specific component. And then it prints it to the screen so we can see what it is. And then basically we then form the URL that we're going to use based on that. So if we look at that Tomcat Manager URL, that's constructed from the information that's in a post-processing script on this command up here. I think it's on that one. Yeah, there it is. So we've got a post-processing script that wrote a little bit of code that says, if it's version 7, do this. If it's version 6, do something else. And that just constructs the URL. So even when you're confronted with things like that are inconsistencies, we can overcome them. You know, there's nothing that gets in our way. Just a little bit of shell scripting, a little bit of JavaScript in the right place, and we have the ability to be as specific or as variabilized as we want. So let's show you this running now. Warns me again that I should have I've made some changes to it. I'm going to go into my Tomcat deployment, hit this button here to run it. Now let me explain a little bit about running processes in UrbanCode Deploy. At the top here we have only changed versions. That means the components where the version that we would deploy now is the same as the version that we deployed previously, it will just ignore them because it's saying, well, I've already deployed version 6.3 of that component. What's the point in redeploying 6.3? And that's really to your advantage, because if you have 30 components and some of them have changed, maybe 5 of them have changed, you really don't want to have to go through picking them out and going, that one's changed, and that one's changed, and that one's changed, and putting a tick next to them and deploying them. UrbanCode knows what's changed compared to what you've previously deployed. It maintains that inventory, and it maintains a record of what we currently have available, so it let UrbanCode make the decision as to what actually does need to deploy. However, if you want to clear that box, you can force it to deploy everything that you now select. The first thing we do is pick a process. So as soon as I pick my application process, UrbanCode understands which components are impacted by that particular application process. And it then allows me to check the versions that I want to select. Now I can use this area here that I'm going to use now to choose specific versions of components, or I can use what's called a snapshot. Now, I don't know how these snapshots are defined in this one actually, but let me explain what a snapshot is. It's a little bit like a sort of baseline in a CM system that covers multiple components. So if you were to create baselines in your source code management system, you might have to do it on a per component basis. And then in some source code management systems like Rational Team Concepts or ClearCase, you have the option of creating kind of a super baseline that includes multiple component baselines. That's what a snapshot is. So instead of having to have a list on a spreadsheet or a scribbled bit of paper that says, for this deployment I need version 17 of that, and 6 of that, 12B of that, you wrap up all of those selections of what you need into a snapshot and just move a snapshot through the life cycle. Now the snapshot includes the versions of all of your content. It includes the versions of all of the properties that have been deployed. It also includes the versions of the processes that were used. And the way we generate a snapshot is actually here with these little camera symbols here on each environment. So if we deploy to development and we like what we've deployed, what we can say is, okay, I want to now push that versions of that content into my QA environment. And then I might want to push that into my production environment. So we take a snapshot of development, and that captures the versions of the content, the properties, and all the processes. So if it then takes me a week to get ready to deploy into QA, and if during that week someone else changed one of the processes, I would not use that new process for my deployment into QA. I would use the version of the process that was used to deploy into development. And that's really important, because people will need to be able to develop and evolve your processes. The last thing you want is someone to save a change to a particular deployment process 2 minutes before you deploy into production on a Saturday night and find that that new version of that process is used and it breaks. That wouldn't be very clever at all. So snapshots are brilliant at the way that they wrap up the ability to say, I'm putting my arms around all my content and my properties and my processes, and I'm going to walk that through my route to life, however long it takes me to do that. For now, I'm going to choose versions individually, and I have now a list available for which version of the Tomcat server do I want to deploy. I've got versions 8, 7, and 6. Let's go for a 7. I can pick the versions of my application I want to deploy. Let's go for version 1.1. And I can pick versions of my database that I want to deploy to. Now, nice things about databases is that you often end up with SQL scripts kind of in sequence. And most customers do this, whereby they will have the master SQL script that makes the necessary changes to the database. And then there'll be another SQL script that makes a slight change that patches the first one. And then there'll be another slightly incremental process change to the database, which is another SQL script. And we have some customers that get up to version 17 or 18 of these incremental layered on scripts that need to be run in the same order to get the database from the changes that we want. We thought we captured in sort of our master database change, which does 90% of the work. And then there's another 16 versions of SQL scripts to generate the next sequence of changes that we need. So when you want to replay all that into a new environment, it can be a little bit arduous. So what I can actually do is I can say, well, I want to run version 1.0, then I want to run version 1.1. So I'm going to, and then put on 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, whatever, and it will run all of those in sequence for us. So let's have a go at that now then and see what that does. Now as an UrbanCode process starts to run, we get this window here that shows us exactly what it's doing. And if we open these up, we can see we're deploying the Tomcat server, and we can have a look at the child process that's running through. So that's downloaded all of the Tomcat binaries. What was it, 400 and some odd files, I think 10 megabytes in 12 seconds. Done the replace of tokens, it's added the execute permission. And if we have a look at one of these blue boxes, it will tell us what it's doing. So it shows the command that's executing and shows us the result that we've got, and that's now completed. If we have a look at what it's doing for our database, we now get the 2 lines listed there, and it's run them both. So it's run version 1.0 and then it run version 1.1, and we are now running the application install on Tomcat. So the application install on Tomcat, there's more steps in here because we are having to go and query Tomcat to find out what version it is so that we know how to deal with it. So we've downloaded the artifacts we want to deploy. Let's have a look at that. So it tells us what it's downloaded, telling us what's out of date, path missing on jpetstore.war, so it downloads that one. Have a look at something else in here. Now we've got a failure there actually. That's kind of to be expected because we've just instantiated a brand new version of Tomcat and there was nothing installed. So my attempt to stop my application on Tomcat, it failed, but we'll allow that. That doesn't really matter. My undeploy of the application on Tomcat also failed, but we're not so bothered about that because we know it wasn't there in the first place. But then I've done a deploy of my application and it tells me the context, deployed my application at context path/jpetstore, and it started the application running on Tomcat. And it tells us that it started, it's okay. These are the sorts of text that you can get a hold of, and you can do some further manipulation of the post-processing script if you want to. So let's just flip across to that other virtual machine, and let's do a refresh on there. And there we go, Apache Tomcat 7054. And if I go to the jpetstore URL, our pet store is running. If we enter the store, now if those database scripts operated properly, we should have 7 dogs for sale. And there we go. So we start off with 6, and that 1.1 of the database change adds on a Bichon dog. So all our database changes were played through there properly. It's probably highly unethical that we are promoting a website that sells dogs over the internet. I'm not quite sure what the Postal Service thinks of that when they ask to deliver one, but never mind. But then again, you're probably not going to find anybody who's creating a website for selling dogs and fish over the internet, I suppose. And reptiles is probably completely illegal. Anyway, back to this process. So you can see now, by using these little blue console window viewers here, that there really is no point to remotely log on to a box. If my VMware system's allowed, I wouldn't even have to switch VMs there, to be honest, to get to that machine. But I couldn't connect through to it for some reason today. So you really can stay at one machine looking at your Firefox console here and managing all your deployments through here. It's 7 minutes to go to the end. I'm going to stop in just 1 second, but I just want to show you a couple of other things. We can go back to look at the entire application process. So here we're looking at the sort of orchestration layer showing we've done Tomcat, we've done the database, we've done the application. And the database does show there 2 of 2. The result now shows 4 out of 4 were successful. You do get these markers at the top that show you how long things took going through the process. So that can be quite interesting if things take, you know, some things take a little bit longer than they should or a little bit longer than they did previously. One interesting thing I heard from a customer recently was that they hand over database changes to another team, and that team mandated that they have 30-minute window available to perform that particular change. And when we put that change into UrbanCode Deploy and ran it through here, we drilled into the process and we were able to tell them that running the SQL script actually took less than a second to run. So their 30-minute window was probably slightly over the top in terms of the amount of time they were asking for and charging for to do the work. So that's kind of shown what we can do for deploying it. We can tidy up after ourselves as well a little bit if we need to. So I can go and run a process here that's going to go and remove the Tomcat instance, choose a version. Now, we have an opportunity here to remove multiple versions, and if we've created those on the server. I'm going to pick an option here that says the current environment inventory, because that is the version that I know is out there. And I'll go and run that one, and just give that a few seconds to run. And that's now successful. So if we now go back to our virtual machine, and nothing's running, and if we have a look in our web server directory, there's nothing in there. So that's nicely tidied up and all disappeared. So you can create something that helps you to manage your middleware layer as well as your applications. You might have multiple versions of application servers that you need to test. You might have multiple different types of application server you need to test. You might be testing on JBoss, on WebSphere Liberty, on WebSphere ND, on Tomcat. Well, if that's the case, then you can create processes with UrbanCode to test a new version of your application across all of those in one operation without any manual intervention whatsoever. Run some tests against it, get some results back. We often get asked about doing things like sort of pre-checks on the environment, because so many deployments fail because the target machine ran out of disk space. So checking disk space is one of the out-of-the-box steps that we have. You can put in an amount of disk space that must be available before it would continue. But you could also put in things like connectivity tests. Can I ping this particular server? And there's so many more things that we could talk about. It's 4 minutes to the hour. I'm going to stop now and see if there are any questions that we have. If there aren't any questions spring to mind now and you think of something later, then please just get in touch with Ranger 4 and we'll work through your questions together. But I just want to thank you for your time. I hope it's been useful, and we'll see what questions we have now to Jinder.
I've got one question. It says, for regulated industries, does UrbanCode come with electronic signatures, and are you able to define users and the environment they can and cannot deploy to?
Right, okay. Let's take that last bit first. We can control the environment and who is allowed to deploy into the environment. So if we go back to our Tomcat application, you can see we have these buttons available down here to deploy. It's one of my other examples that's not running at the moment, but it does show that in production you don't have that circle with the triangle in there, so you can't deploy to production as a regular user. And different users with a different security role and permission have the authority to deploy into that particular environment. So it is easy to control who can deploy into each environment based on security role types. The other comment about that is that everything we've looked at today is part of a security permission group. So you can control who can do what. You do have a good separation of duties. So you can control who can manage the resources, but they can't run processes or edit processes. You can control who can edit and run processes, but they can't manage the resources and suddenly allocate themselves on 150 test servers. Now, with electronic signatures, we don't have an electronic signature facility. What we do have is an option here that says require approval. And I'm just going to go and turn that on for a second on my development environment. I'm going to say this one does require approval. And as soon as I do that, I then get the option here to create an approval process. And I can create approvers for the application, the environment, or a specific component. And when I drag that across, I can add in additional properties that need to be filled out by that user. Now, what we do have here is the ability to record secure properties. So there, someone could type in a password and we can validate it as part of the process. But we don't have an actual electronic signature process built into the product in here at the moment. but we certainly do have an approval process that's based on roles that we could use, and we do use, to manage access to that. So basically the scenario here would be that anyone could request the deployment if they have the permission to do so, but it then immediately stops and goes into a queue, and the person who is the approver role gets a notification based on this notification template that we've defined here, and that notification says there is an approval waiting for you, gives them a URL to hit, and they hit that and they go in and they either say start it or don't start it. And you can do that at any point through the process as well. You can hit what we call a manual step, and the manual step will pause the process even after it's done half a dozen things for different machines. It will pause the process and it will wait for an approval person to say accept or reject, and if they accept, it will continue. So
Okay.
I hope that answers that question.
Can the deployment also be scheduled to run automatically?
Yes, it can. If we go back to deployment a second, and we hit deployment, here we have scheduled deployment, and you can make them recurring as well, and the recurrence can be sort of a daily pattern at a specific date and time. So yes, we can make things scheduled to run at 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning if you need them to. You don't have to be in the office or logged in from home.
Okay, thank you for that. Thanks for the great presentation, Mark. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and thanks for attending today's webcast. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to email me them. But bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.